Hello and welcome to Book Club, where this month we're crossing between two worlds, those of the living and the dead. Our welcome guest today in Bush House is Will Self, journalist, short story writer, novelist. And our chosen book is his novel How the Dead Live. It's a novel that owes quite a bit to science fiction, it seems. Lily Bloom is 65, vicious, scabrous, unpleasant. She's dying of breast cancer. Her two daughters are with her some of the time. One is pretty straight-laced, the other's a drug user. Self describes Lily Bloom's last days with great emotion and tenderness in the first part of the book. Then, as she passes on to another world, he takes us on her journey out of the hospital ward with her Aboriginal guide and into a taxicab driven by a Cypriot down the Balls Pond Road to a fictitious area in East London, Dalston, where Lily has to spend eternity. So how do the dead live? Well, for Will Self, they seem to live sometimes rather like we do. Lily's reunited with her son, who died in the 50s. She gets a job, gets bored, enjoys chain-smoking a great deal, watches her daughters from afar, wanders the streets of London as people do, like a ghostly Molly Bloom, you might think. She has other weird companions, a lithopedian, who's her calcified stillborn child, and the Fats, who are eyeless creatures made up of all the weight that Lily lost during her life. Well, we're asking our assembled readers here to come with Lily into that world and to see what they make of it. Will Self, welcome to Book Club. It's a strange world that you take us into in this book. How did the writing of it come about? In the sense, how much was it affected by your personal circumstances at the time?
Well, I think it was influenced a great deal. I think it's a very felt novel. And the central germ of it, the idea that really got me going, and I think in the kind of books I write, my experience of conceiving of them is like some kind of nuclear fission. You know, I have an idea and then it bursts into all sorts of other ideas, and the central idea really was about my own mother, and it was coming up to about her 10th anniversary. It was the 10th anniversary of her death, and it occurred to me that when one's loved somebody very much, the first few years after they're dead, you can think of them walking back into the room. And often you do. That's a sort of an experience that one has in mourning. But as the years pass, that becomes increasingly impossible to conceive of. And at some numinous but nonetheless definite point, they become deader. And it struck me that the sense in which people become deader is that they become anachronistic. They're out of style. They wouldn't look right. If they walked into the studio now, they'd be wearing the wrong cut of dress, or they'd be wearing their hair wrong. And when I thought of that, it occurred to me that in our highly, rapidly changing society we live in, the perspective of the dead person would be perhaps the greatest critique we could have.
Does anyone want to come in on that? Yes.
Can you maybe pick up on what I know is a big influence of this book, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which I believe in those final moments of death, you have some sort of new awareness. This creates a new reality for yourself. Your own reality is like that of a dream. You might say that Lily's narration of her life is that dreamlike reality, as adumbrated in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Was it your intention to have that? Do you think Lily has succeeded in doing that?
Yes, I did adopt the sort of schema of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and in a sense it's a kind of Occidental Tibetan Book of the Dead, if you like, a kind of North London Book of the Dead. For people who are familiar with Tibetan Buddhism, the Bhadat Tadol, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, sets out, it's a manual of instructions to be read to you while you are dying. And what it tells you essentially is that when you die, your psyche will disincorporate. And this phenomenon will be terrifying as your passions, the most basic parts of your nature, come back to you in the form of a kind of chimerical play that you're involved in. And really what you have to do is to perceive that as illusion. If you want to attain nirvana, if you want to be enlightened, you have to not be taken in by this and not be fooled. But if you are taken in by it, you will be reborn.
How did you come up with the idea of necropolitan London, as I think it's been described, where the dead live alongside us?
And Dalston.
Yes.
Sounds rather familiar.
I think, yes, Dalston and the necropolitan London. You know, You don't sort of research fiction except through life, but of course these ideas have been current before. I mean, other people have conceived of a dead London alongside the live London. But really that idea goes a long way back in my kind of fictional thinking, and really dates to an afternoon when I found myself in Acton in the mid to late 80s. And I mean no disrespect of Acton at all, which I love. But it suddenly occurred to me that not only could you look at the infinitude of London, meant that not only could you look at an individual walking in the street and think they might be alive or dead, I've no way of telling, but you could also look at whole suburbs and think to yourself they might be inhabited by dead people, and nobody in the adjoining suburbs would have any idea. Such is the magnitude of the city and its degree of very basic alienation.
Is the American woman Lily, who is dying of cancer, a metaphor for society?
I think the thing about Lily is that what she does personify for me is several things. One, what it's like to die if you have absolutely no belief in the transcendent, which I think is true for a lot of us. And it's mostly true for me. So, you know, it's approaching that idea. What is it like? Throughout our lives, we say to ourselves, well, I don't believe in anything. I don't believe in any personal immortality. I don't even believe in any impersonal immortality. But what does that actually feel like at the moment of death? So I think she becomes kind of every woman and every man at the point that you take on board. And for me, some of the most painful passages were trying to imagine what the actual moments of death would be like for her, how that would feel, and the kind of colossal weight of fear that must surround that. The other aspect of her character, which I think is troubling and I think is present in a lot of us, is summed up for me by her kind of Jewish anti-Semitism, which I know is a contentious and a difficult thing. And of course, you know, in the influence of political correctness is that we don't kind of want to believe that people who come from persecuted minorities are full of self-hatred. But I think that, you know, just as somebody once said, the Jews are like everybody else, but more so. So I think it's true that the kind of Jewish anti-Semite is like everybody else, but a little bit more so. So I wanted to heighten this idea that through fear of death, we all become a bit bigoted, and we all become in the secular world.
There's one here, and then there.
One of the reasons I love this book is all the bits you've been influenced from Beckett, and sort of the beginning of the book reminds me of bits from More Pricks Than Kicks. The middle of the book is like the trilogy, and the end of the book you've got a passage, I don't know if you've ever experienced Being Born, which just reminds me of some of that late prose. Is that accidental, or did you actually think, I'm drawing like the whole of Beckett's work sort of like is a thread through this novel?
I not only think that it's accidental, I also think that it must be mystical, because all I have ever read of Beckett is about 20 pages of How It Is, the beginning of Murphy. I've seen one stage production of Endgame, and I've probably heard tiny bits of the late prose, but I've never actually read it. I might have seen a production of Waiting for Godot on the TV. So I'm really not a Beckettian. At the time the book was published, many critics said, oh, well, he's ripped this off from Joyce, he's steeped in Ulysses. I've only read half of Ulysses. I read it 25 years ago when I was in Morocco in a somewhat altered state. So I find it strange that I could have so marvellously recapitulated it. And I've never read the Night Town scene with Molly Bloom. So
is Beckett influencing you beyond the grave?
Well, either that or Beckett and I have approached the same questions and achieved a certain kind of artistic coherence in the approach to them, which I think happened.
You said in the past that you're not that wild about characters, you're not that interested in characters. Would you like to expand on that, sort of in relation to Lily?
Because Lily is a big, rounded, dominating character. That's the point, isn't it? The whole book revolves, and despite what you said about Ulysses and not having been able to finish it, perhaps because of the state you were in, although some people might think that that might help, the choice of the word bloom, I mean, there's an obvious reference to the sort of Jewish London community that's involved here. But Bloom, everyone thinks of the wanderings of Joyce's Bloom.
I confess it was very far from my mind. My grandmother's name was Lillian Rosenblum. So, you know, my mother's maiden name was Rosenblum. I didn't have to look any further than that for my name. And
what about the question of the character, the size of the character in the book, which is not exactly a departure, but a development for you in the fiction.
Yes, my argument isn't actually so much with character as the way that character relates to narrative. You know, and the way that characters are built around narratives, and the way that so many fictions hinge on improbable coincidences. And then my lover from 20 years ago turned out to be holding the boom at the recording of Bookclub, and we got together again. And actually, that's never happened. My life seems curiously shapeless when I compare it to most fiction. And yet, when you read fiction, people's character is advanced by these improbable coincidences. And I think, my problem as a creator of character has been trying to avoid that. And, the way I've done it, and I can think of other writers who do it this way, is to, if I'm going to deal with the character, and in a sense, How the Dead Live is the first book where I've really gone overboard with a character. I've had other different kinds of characters before, is to create a monomaniac character, a character who sort of eats up the text in that way. And, that's fine. That's fine. Of course I want to know about character, but I also think that it's to do with middle age, because I think some writers, of course, deal with character from a very early age and can see people in the round and get that kind of parallax of time where they can see what's been important in other people's lives. But it must be a remarkable gift to be able to see with that kind of clarity and depth when you're in your 20s, for example. And it seems to me that only comes with age. You only see somebody over 20, 30 years when you're a bit older.
This is a good place to hear you read from the book, and I think an appropriate place to start is at the beginning.
How the Dead Live, April 1999. We old women are easily erased from the picture of the last century. We're an entire demographic grouping of Trotskys. Like the once dapper Jew, we too stand with nonchalant unease at the base of that wooden pulpit, hastily erected on the platform of the Finland station. Shorn of moustache and goatee, our collective chin is rounded, awfully vulnerable, already anticipating the cold smack of the assassin's steel. Deprived of pince-nez, our eyes are squinting into the limelight. What a mistake it was, we seem to be entreating future historians, to dress down for posterity. If only we'd kept our Trotsky costume on, not loaned our shoes to Lenin, then we wouldn't be facing this airbrushing out, this undeveloping, this eternal bloody deletion. Where, oh where are the old women of the 20th century? Where have we all gone? So few films, photographs and television pictures include us. Even when we were featured, the real intention was to emphasize the props. See how old that coat is, bulky that sack is, worn out those shoes are. And next to the great men of the age, we were merely mothers, or women old enough to be their mothers, or women whose age made us childlessness personified, as time turned tail, and our old vaginas, like ancient vacuum cleaners, sucked up the unformed, the unbecome, the unborn.
Thank you very much. I think you've got a question about the opening of the book.
I did find the epilogue, the opening, quite mournful.
I'll get away with you.
Well, it's worth saying that, of course...
really.
Put on your happy face.
This is after she's dead. We're talking here about an epilogue which starts the book, which comes, in a sense, out of time.
Absolutely. Did this come from your own sense of ageing, or do you sort of enjoy the grumpy old man status that people see you in now?
The curse of the grumpy old man. I had no idea that show was going to take off like that. It drives me mad.
I think it identifies with people of a certain age.
Yes.
Myself included.
Yes. I certainly wrote this book in response to a very early midlife crisis, I think.
Was your midlife crisis the fact that you were writing this book, as the phrase goes, clean, i.e. not boozing to excess and not injecting yourself or swallowing various substances which had been the stuff of life for you in decades gone by?
It certainly is, and I've been quite open about this, though one's very leery of kind of playing to the kind of, modern sort of psychobabble view of literature, but it's difficult as a contemporary writer and one who's been in the public eye and been known as Jim put it quite kindly, as something of a hellraiser, not to confront all of this stuff. And the fact was that this was a book that I wrote when I cleaned up from a 20-year alcohol and heroin addiction. So, you know, it did kind of, I think what had happened was that a lot of those issues around mortality had been stuffed down by all of that intoxication, and they all came up to hit me like a rake. Actually, I started writing the book, and it was the other way around. I started writing it, and I thought, I cannot say anything meaningful about death. These themes came to me unless I'm sober. You know, it's too important, this stuff. I need to be sober.
Lily Bloom describes Natasha, her heroin-addicted daughter, as being complete and confident. When she's high, she's a peach. When she's off heroin, she's a nightmare. Can we assume there's something of the author in the character of Natasha? And if so, were you a nightmare, occasional peach?
Well, one of my children said to me the other day, because it's something we often discuss, said to me the other day, "Do you still want to be a woman?" Because I've often told them about Tiresias, who, you know, was asked by the gods, you know, what he most wanted. He said he'd like to be a woman for 7 years. Frankly, if the gods appeared to me, I think I'd probably say to them as well. And I think that writing fiction, one of the most astonishing things you can do is to change gender. You can change ethnicity. You can change religion. You can change all sorts of things in that way. And, you know, I think I played with the character of Natasha by making her this kind of beautiful, if rather scabby femme fatale. You know, I wanted to be a beautiful woman, of course, rather shamelessly. Terrible narcissism. Is it an accurate portrait of me? Addiction is a terribly stereotypic illness. It's a very defined pathology in that way. So it's as much true of me in active addiction as I think as is true of any other addict. She's a kind of true to the type, I think.
This raises the whole point of a male writer, a man trying to think himself into female characters, which is something that does, to me, seem to come off in the book quite remarkably. How difficult did you find it to do that, really for the first time, to this degree?
Well, I approach being a woman at a physical level. I start with the assumption that I menstruate and that I have breasts and a vagina, and and I work on from that to see what it's like psychologically.
You mean you really think yourself into a woman's form?
I think it's the only way to do it. I think if you start the other way round, you can't be sure that you're a woman.
So you don't sit down without crossing your legs while you're writing the book, is that right?
I haven't quite got to that point. When I wrote my strange parallel ape world book, Great Apes, I did swing around in the garden and pant-hoot a lot. I found that incredibly useful.
You've got the arms for it.
I do, thank you so much. You wouldn't make a bad ape yourself, you know. I don't think I went that far, but I certainly do sit at the typewriter sort of thinking, what would it be like to have a female form? Yes, I do.
Got a question here, I think.
What interested me was that you presented a lot of positive and negative aspects of drugs. I think some people might accuse you of glamorising the world of drugs in some sense. On the other hand, we have the incredibly squalid death of Natasha and her unborn child. On balance, would you say you come out with a positive or a negative view for us?
Well, I think the view of what I would describe as the pathological use of drugs, of drug addiction, is extremely negative. And funnily enough, it's always been really negative in my books. It's never been viewed positively. You know, that's not been my personal experience of it. And despite relapsing for many years, I had a period in sobriety in the 1980s. So I always knew what it was I was running away from. So I think in my writing career, I've tended to be very, very critical of drugs in relation to addiction and alcohol in relation to alcoholism. But I think I've also presented, hopefully, a picture of that culture in the round, you know, which is a more problematic and difficult thing to do. But I certainly resist the charge that they're glamorized. I think that what it is they're not tidied under the carpet in any way.
Yeah, the gentleman at the back, and then here.
Hanif Qureshi says that he writes to commune with his dead father, and I feel that you write to commune with your dead mother.
No, I write to commune with Hanif's dead father. I mean, why should he be the only one involved in that discourse?
I feel that Lily Bloom could be your ideal reader.
I don't mean to be facetious. Somebody once said that for all male writers, their first book is an act of parricide, is an act of father killing. You know, and there is a sense, of course, in which we're involved as writers and as people outside of literature in a very vital discourse with, particularly with parents if they're dead. You know, there are things unsaid in that way. And, you know, I wouldn't discount that as an element in what I'm doing at a psychic level. But I don't think that's the whole story.
I was going to ask a question about the location of the book, which shifts sort of to Australia. Is Australia also a place that's quite familiar to you, or why did you choose it?
Well, I basically did that to annoy Australians. I mean, they do get very, very uptight if you said anything in Australia at all, and you almost have to go and ask permission from the High Commission, which is handy for Bush House. No, I've spent about, over the last 20 years or so, I've spent about a year in Australia, here and there. So, you know, my
In
rule...
what sort of state?
In what sort of state? In the Northern Territory, actually, a lot of it. In a good enough state, I think, to be able to learn a little bit about the country. I mean, my maxim as a writer is that, you know, I think there's about 17 to maybe 25 pages of How the Dead Live is set in Australia. A year will give you 25 pages, maybe, you know, if you're lucky. I'm a writer of place, really. I'm very concerned with place. Place is a kind of muse for me, particularly London. So I wouldn't hazard, for example, to set a whole novel in Australia, but having spent a year there, I figured I could get away with 25 pages.
Well, could you tell us a little bit about your relationship with the colour grey? London is grey, pretty much everything is grey. I think in the past you've said you don't have a great perception of colour. Occasionally we get tiny spots of colour like the gods in Dalston, but at the end, I mean, Lily extemporises, gives a rhapsody on the theme of grey. So do you actually revel in the greyness of things?
Well, it's dreadful, isn't it? I mean, I not only am I quite severely colourblind, but I've become sort of hysterically colourblind as well. I mean, I find my colour perception getting worse when it's challenged. As you were saying that, I thought, yeah, she's right, I can't see anything anymore. I don't know what colours even are. And I sometimes look back over things I've written and realise that absolutely nothing has been described in colour terms. I mean, but it's not that severe, my colour blindness. It's just obviously not the richest part of the perception of the world for me. And yes, I do revel in it. I wrote a book called Grey Area.
Do you ever worry that your verbal excess alienates readers?
What, actually in the text?
Yeah, just the wordiness of everything. I mean, a lot of people find that quite intimidating.
Yeah.
Do you worry that people are...
And the unusual words. Which...
Yeah.
I'm not really bothered about that at all, no. I've never been bothered about it. Andrew Dworkin once said to me, why do you think it is that Hemingway is the most popular writer in creative writing classes? And I said, well, you know, I'm not exactly sure, but he's a kind of relatively simple prose writer. And she said, he's easy to imitate. And, you know, I think there's a kind of fetishization of this kind of simple writing, when in fact simplicity is as alien to our mental processes and the way we live our lives as complexity may not capture it. You know, we're dealing here with an artificial construction. I mean, in terms of alienating or attracting readers, I hate to get all high-tony about this, but that's not why I'm writing. If I wanted to do that, I'd go into writing advertising copy. I wouldn't be writing novels at all.
Gentleman here, I think, on this point, and then at the front, yeah.
Given your very ludic approach to language, do you think sometimes you can't resist the temptation to put something in, even though it might not necessarily flow easily with the voice of the character you're trying to use? I mean, I must admit, I found that personally. There were certain plays on words and puns that suddenly I found myself tripping over them, so I thought, that doesn't sound like Lily, it sounds like Will.
Yeah, no, I think I would take that criticism, and I have banned myself from puns, funnily enough. I have banned myself from puns, and I wrote a novella last year called Dr. Naughtie, where I typed it, in fact, so on a manual typewriter, because I was worried that the very speed of a computer keyboard was allowing me to run away with myself and, you know, play around with these ideas, and that if I had the discipline of having to retype an entire page once I mean...
So you slowed yourself down?
I slowed myself down deliberately, and one of the rules was that I did ban punning. It did strike me as getting out of control, and I don't actually like it in other people's prose either. I mean, the other thing, of course, that some people found kind of hard to stomach about the book was how foul-mouthed Lily is and how much she swears. But again, that was very much drawn from life. We have this kind of chocolate box English heritage view of literary fiction, and it is a problem for the writer. I think if you want to render the actual tenor of the way a lot of people speak, think, then you can't delete expletives. Just as how, I wrestle with this, and I wrestle with the extent to which prose fiction can really do certain kinds of verisimilitude, because when I pick up a lot of fiction, it seems to me highly artificial. Even the books that are meant to be kind of naturalistic. Wow, that's great dialogue, that's really what... For a start, they're often full of appalling kind of continuity errors. Meals last about 7 minutes. But more insidious things, like people tend to speak over each other. People tend to run words together. People tend to phoneticize a lot. And people swear like buggery.
Last question here in the front.
One thing I did earlier this week, when thinking about what to talk about today, was to go back through the internet to the criticism of this book. And it wasn't all, to any means, entirely positive. Is there anything you care about, or do you just think, well, that's their opinion, I'm proud of it?
Well, I think this is a forum of ruthless honesty, and I think that the reception of this novel is one of the things that hasn't made me stop caring about newspaper notices of books when they come out, but it's made me much more chary of paying much attention to them. Because this book did very well. It gained a big readership, and it's still gaining a readership, and people seem to find it speaks to them. Whatever its drawbacks as a text, and there are many, it seems to speak to them, particularly to people who've lost a parent, which is what I wanted to talk about and how I wanted to communicate.
Will Self, thank you very much indeed for being our guest on Book Club this month.